I'll go on Instagram and I'll go down this rabbit hole. Do you guys know who Coach Eric Paulson is? I will go down this rabbit hole of watching Coach Paulson showing technique to his students, and an hour will go by. Now, if you stay on TikTok, if you stay on Instagram long enough, the company will send you a warning. Do you guys know about this? This actually happens where they will send you, hey, you've been on here. Why don't you consider going and doing something else? They'll actually tell you that. And that's when I'll realize that an hour has gone by. But I'm very captivated. I'm very captivated when I watch Eric Paulson showing techniques. Eric Paulson is one of these guys who wears a gi, who brings in students, who trains students. They go off, they do MMA. They go compete. They have goals. They want to go through Abu Dhabi in the process to go to Abu Dhabi themselves. But he doesn't represent jiu-jitsu. He represents catch wrestling. Now, I've only met a few catch guys in my life that will actually brand themselves as that. You guys likely only know one name, which is Josh Barnett. Josh Barnett did more with and did more for catch wrestling than anybody else that I can think of. But when I meet these guys, Neil Melanson comes to mind. They say that Lou Thez and some of these old-time professional wrestlers, if you know who Lou Thez is, you think, oh, professional wrestler, what's the big deal? Well, professional wrestling that you know today, which is scripted and predetermined, did not used to be that way. Those guys were really trying to pin and or submit each other. The history of professional wrestling is very fascinating. In fact, let me stay on that for just a second. These guys were really trying to pin and stretch. Right? We call it tap out. They used to call it stretch. Make the other guy submit one another. There's only so many of them. There's 6, 7, there's 8 guys. I mean, they're riding in the car together, all beat up, going to the next town. One of them finally says, how about we pretend that we're beating each other up? I mean, that is how professional wrestling got to where it is today, back in Lou Thesz's day. And Lou Thez was my father's idol. I never heard my father say that about another man. He said, that's my idol. And as I got older, I started to learn out why. Well, Lou Thez was really doing these things, and I'm sharing that with you because catch wrestling is rare. Matt Hume, who I consider the wizard. I consider Matt Hume the leader of MMA in this regard. If you have the 5 top coaches in the world, okay? If you got Clayton Hires and you got Javier and you got Perillo and you got Faraz and you got Greg Jackson in a room arguing about a technique. Well, your thumb should go this way and your hip should go here. And you want to pull the arm to the left and not to your right. If you got the top 5 coaches in the world, and they're arguing. They can't decide on what the perfect way to explain a technique is. And Matt Hume walks in and says, this is how you do it. That conversation will now end. All of the coaches will simply go, oh, they will not push back and resist. But Matt Hume, time-wise, can be met with equal opposition by one guy, which is Eric Paulson. So Eric Paulson and Matt Hume got put in a fight against each other. I believe they fought multiple times. Now, set that aside. Myself, I'm in college, and I know that I want to go and be an MMA fighter, and I've got the whole system rigged. I got the whole system rigged because I watched a guy called the King of the Streets, Marco Huas, and I found in the back of Black Belt magazine, I found a tape that if I set in a check, $20, I'm going to get something called a VHS, and it's Hidden Secrets of Fighting by Marco Huas, and I go get the tape. I'm the only guy with the tape. I watched this tape a million times, but I understand something. The year is 1997, and I understand, so I'm not telling anybody. I'm not telling anybody my secret, which is I was a college wrestler. I was a lifelong wrestler. But I'm taking boxing lessons privately. Got a guy named Kip Triplett out of Eugene, Oregon. I'm giving him $10 an hour. I'm taking boxing lessons. So when I graduate college, I'm going to know how to box a little bit. I'm going to have my wrestling skills. I'm going to be the most well-rounded force this sport has ever seen. This is my secret plan. What I'm going to do that nobody knows, didn't tell anybody I was taking boxing lessons. This whole thing. It's going to trick the system. By the time I got out of college, you can see where my master plan was not quite evolved in front of the entire world. But somewhere along the way, I ended up in a practice room. I got Dan Henderson, I got Randy Couture, I got Jeff Munson. I mean, I'm name dropping right now. Dan was doing his thing in Pride. Randy had already been the champion, and Jeff Munson was the Abu Dhabi gold medalist. So young man is in there named Dennis Hallman. And Dennis Hallman just ties us all up, one after the next. What is going on? I went home that day and I told my father I met the greatest fighter in the world. And Dennis Hallman was getting ready to fight Jens Pulver for a world championship. My father found a bookie. Put $5,000 down on Dennis Hallman just on me coming home and saying, this is the greatest talent I've ever seen. And Dennis Hallman told me about this guy named Matt Hume, who's running a gym in Seattle area, Tacoma area, called AMC. Called the AMC. American Martial Arts Academy. What would it be called? What would that stand for? At any rate, Dennis shows us about 5 moves, and these are just the most tricky techniques I'd ever. There was one where you stretch a guy's arm, but we never heard of this. We never heard of arm bars. And at Team Quest, we're winning world championships. We had a gentleman come to town named John Lewis. John Lewis was a black belt in jiu-jitsu. He was also the only black belt that had ever come through Team Quest at the time. And something was very big called a scissor sweep, where if you're on the bottom, you're going to come and you're going to scissor sweep the guy. But John Lewis had a defense to that, where you took your hand, you made a fist, you pushed it between the ground, you came to a cradle, and you actually passed the guy's guard. We ran with that for 1 year. At Team Quest, we ran with that one technique because it was the absolute only technique that we knew for 1 year, and we felt brilliant to know it. And Dan Henderson remained undefeated. Matt Lindland became the #1 ranked guy in the world, and Randy Couture had the belt. And we believed that this was right. And Dennis Hallman comes in and tells us that he learns five new moves every night when he goes to Matt Hume's practice. I'm thinking there aren't 5 moves that exist. Nobody has 5 moves. Then there's this young man. Now, I should have been teammates. Josh Barnett. When I was coming up with my shtick, when I'm coming up and I'm getting headlines and I'm getting in front of the world, anybody that was a champion or was tougher or was perceived to be tougher than me was fair game. And I was burying all of them, including guys that were off limits. I was burying the Nogueira brothers. Everybody loves the Nogueira brothers. I'm taking down the Nogueira brothers. I'm taking on the Gracies. Can you believe it? I'm taking on everybody. This guy gets a camera, puts a camera on me, says, what do you think of Josh Barnett? Now, even in my day of trying to get attention, and even in my day of burying everybody, I couldn't bring myself to do it to him. Josh Barnett is one of the great misunderstood stories in the history of MMA. When you talk about a Mount Rushmore, when you want to talk about the true greats that have ever done it, and you don't include Josh Barnett, it pisses me off. And I've had this conversation with meaningful people. I've had this with Cain Velasquez. I've had this with Stipe Miocic. I've had this with Travis Brown. I have had this with Matt Mitrione. I've had this with Daniel Cormier. Did I say Daniel twice? They will all talk about Josh Barnett, top 3 heavyweight ever. I believe it's further. I believe Josh Barnett is a top 3 fighter ever. That's what I believe. Not just heavyweight. If you're talking about the top 3 fighters to have ever done it, you need to include Josh Barnett. If you're talking about the top 3 heavyweights to have ever done it and you don't include Josh Barnett, you and I are all done talking because you lost credibility. Josh Barnett was 19. We were supposed to be teammates. We should have been teammates in college, and Josh wanted to come to the University of Oregon. I don't have that whole story. Josh mentioned in passing one time. And Josh and I are the same age. I forget that too. I always think he's older. I think he's older because I've always looked up to him. When he was 19 years old, they bring him out to something called Super Brawl. Super Brawl was one of the massive events in our sport, to the point that Dana White personally would sit in the audience and take notes. He would take and he would discover guys and he would sign them out of Super Brawl. But they brought in Josh Barnett, who was a 19-year-old kid. He's going to go get beat up in Super Brawl because he's taking on a guy known as the Beast, Dan Severn. Josh not only won the fight, he submitted Dan Severn. And it was so shocking. A lot of you don't even know that. It got swept. It was so shocking. People swept it under the rug like it didn't happen. They all just thought it was a fluke. And that same 19-year-old kid goes on to become the world champion. When Josh Barnett returned to the UFC, Josh Barnett was champion and left the UFC and left the belt behind. There's another piece of the story. I bet you guys don't remember that. And when Josh returned to the UFC, I'm thinking of the caption, right? Josh Barnett returns to claim the championship that he never lost. I mean, I'm picturing this is on billboards. This is going to be everywhere. Nobody went with it. That wasn't the theme. When Josh came back, he was just one of the boys. And I didn't think he should have been. He was the champion who left the organization, left the belt behind, and he came back to reclaim his championship. I'm just sharing with you these stories that I think are great ones, don't always get told the right way. But along the way, Josh Barnett switched coaches. And he began training with Erik Paulson. Erik Paulson was a former rival of Matt Hume, and I've just always wondered why. How did we get here? How did Josh Barnett leave Matt Hume to go against one of Matt Hume's great rivals, a former opponent? Finally asked Josh Barnett. I just asked him the question. How did you end up with Coach Paulson? It wasn't what you would think. Paulson and Hume, while being opponents and having equal respect and minds for the innovation of the sport, were actually friends. They were buddies. And Matt Hume was starting to have other things between family, between kids. Now he's an executive over one championship. All the things that were coming with Matt Hume. Matt said, hey, Josh, it might be better. If you want consistency, if you really want something that can be here every single day the way we used to, it might be better if you go over in this direction. And he did. And that might be a simple story for you guys. But it's one that I have always wondered. Just always wondered, how did this happen? Then you got a guy like Josh Barnett, who I believe could win Abu Dhabi. Now, that may not be true as we sit here today and he's not focused on combat and he's thinking about professional wrestling and he's being a promoter and going in these different directions. But I just believe that his skills and the understanding of catch wrestling, which is a fascinating sport, and nothing gets over until you get the right athlete. Taekwondo does not work. Well, we haven't seen it work yet. But what level of athletes have we had that are doing it? Karate doesn't work. We proved that in 1993. Well, Machida steps in, followed by Wonder Boy. You have a different level of athlete that can bring in and represent this sport. It's very fascinating to me. It's very fascinating the way we forget. Or maybe I should even say the way that we remember. But there's a lot of moving parts. And if you're somebody like Josh Barnett that's on an absolute pursuit for knowledge, and you start with the wizard Matt Hume and you get passed over to Paulson, there's knowledge and there's information that you can gain. In the day of having secret techniques, like the video that I went and bought of Marco Huas, that was real at one point. There were secret techniques. In the day before there was the internet, before you could share information, before I meet a guy named Dennis Hallman who tells me there's a gym up the road and they're working on things. I'm at Team Quest. We're the power of the world. We had one move. Didn't even finish your opponent. The move that John Lewis didn't even finish the opponent. It just was a move, and we didn't know any.